Some mysteries are never meant to be solved. Some photographs are never meant to be seen. And some explorations lead to places you can never return from. This is the story of 4 urban explorers who discovered something impossible in an abandoned farmhouse. Something that should never have existed. What happened to them in the weeks that followed defies explanation. The evidence contradicts itself. The witnesses can't be trusted. And the only person who claims to remember the truth might be completely insane. But before you dismiss her story, ask yourself this. In a world where everyone carries a camera, where every moment is documented and shared, how do you explain photographs that show things no camera should have been able to capture? How do you explain images of people who swear they were alone? And what do you do when the impossible becomes undeniable? The Lost Spaces team had been documenting abandoned locations for 3 years. Jake handled the cameras. Emma researched the histories. Phil managed their tech and security. And Hannah captured the artistic shots that made their content stand out. They were careful explorers, professional. They never took unnecessary risks, never left traces of their presence, never explored alone. Which is what made their final discovery so disturbing. Because the photographs they found in that Victorian farmhouse showed them breaking every one of their own rules. The drive north started normally enough. Emma noticed a van following them, but when Phil confronted the driver at a fuel station, the vehicle drove off. Probably nothing. A coincidence. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She'd been having that feeling a lot lately. At home, on the street, even in places where she should have been completely alone. Her friends dismissed it as pre-exploration nerves. Emma had always been the most anxious member of their group. They had no way of knowing that Emma's instincts were absolutely correct. Someone was watching them. Someone had been watching them for a very long time. The farmhouse had been abandoned since the 1990s, when Margaret Whitmore disappeared without a trace. Local legends claimed she'd been taken by something that lived in the walls. But Hannah's research suggested a more mundane explanation. Financial troubles and a quiet relocation to a local nursing home. The building was structurally sound, but thoroughly decayed. Perfect for their documentation project. They spent the morning filming the ground floor, capturing the slow reclamation of domestic spaces by nature and time. Everything was proceeding normally, until Emma stepped on the loose floorboard in the upstairs bedroom. The shoebox beneath contained 43 Polaroid photographs. All of them showed the 4 friends. All of them had been taken within the past 6 months. All of them were impossible. The first photograph showed Jake sleeping in his bed, taken from an angle that would have required the photographer to be floating outside his 3rd floor window. The second showed Hannah in her childhood bedroom at her parents' house, a room she hadn't slept in for years. The third showed Phil in his shower, the timestamp indicating it had been taken just 3 days earlier. The fourth showed Emma crying in her kitchen at 3 a.m., captured from a position that would have required someone to be standing inside her refrigerator. Each photograph was more impossible than the last. Angles that defied physics. Locations that should have been inaccessible. Moments of privacy that no one else should have witnessed. But the images were undeniably real. The Polaroid stock was authentic, the chemical development genuine. These weren't digital manipulations or clever fakes. Someone had been watching them, photographing them, collecting moments of their lives like specimens in a jar. But how? And why? Jake wanted to go to the police immediately. Phil thought they should investigate the building more thoroughly, look for hidden cameras or surveillance equipment. Hannah pointed out how insane their story would sound. Who would believe that someone had been taking impossible photographs of them for months? But Emma was studying the images more carefully. She'd noticed something the others had missed. In the background of several photos, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. Always the same person. Always watching. Always just out of clear focus. A tall man in a dark coat, holding what appeared to be a camera. Emma had seen that figure before. In her peripheral vision, in reflections, in the spaces between sleep and waking. She'd thought it was paranoia, stress, her imagination creating threats that didn't exist. But the photographs proved she'd been right all along. Someone had been stalking them. Someone was still stalking them. They decided to continue their planned exploration route, but everything had changed. Every shadow could hide a watcher. Every reflection might reveal a photographer. Every moment of privacy felt violated. Emma's behavior became increasingly erratic. She checked locks obsessively, covered windows, jumped at unexpected sounds. The others were disturbed, but tried to maintain some normalcy. They had commitments, schedules, a reputation to maintain. But Emma couldn't let go. She began researching surveillance techniques, studying the photographs for clues, trying to understand how someone could have captured these impossible images. Her internet searches led her down rabbit holes of conspiracy theories and paranoid speculation. Government surveillance programs, corporate espionage, experimental technology that could explain the impossible angles and access. She found reports of similar incidents. Other people claiming to have found photographs of themselves in impossible circumstances. Most were dismissed as hoaxes or delusions. But Emma was beginning to see a pattern. The second location they explored yielded another box of photographs. This time, the images were more recent, more invasive. Emma brushing her teeth that morning. Phil checking his security system the night before. Hannah researching their current location on her laptop. Jake reviewing footage from their previous exploration. Someone had been watching them continuously, documenting their every move, their every private moment. But these photographs revealed something even more disturbing. In several images, Emma's friends appeared to be looking directly at the camera. Not with surprise or fear, but with what looked like recognition, as if they knew they were being photographed, as if they were posing. Emma confronted them about this, but Jake, Hannah, and Phil seemed genuinely confused. They had no memory of being aware of any photographer, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with their reactions. They seemed different. Less concerned than they should be, almost relieved to have found the second batch of photographs, as if they'd been expecting them. Emma's friends gradually stopped responding to her messages. Jake claimed he was busy with work. Hannah said she needed a break from exploration. Phil insisted that staying away from each other would make them safer, but Emma suspected something else was happening. She'd been monitoring their social media accounts, and their posting patterns had changed. The language was slightly different. The interests had shifted. Even their profile photos looked somehow wrong, like the same faces, but with different expressions behind the eyes. Emma began to wonder if her friends had been replaced. It sounded insane, even to her, but the evidence was mounting. The photographs, the behavioral changes, the way they'd seemed to recognize the camera in those later images. What if the stalker hadn't just been watching them? What if he'd been taking them, one by one, replacing them with something else? Something that looked like her friends, but wasn't quite right. Emma realized she might be the only real person left. Emma's investigation led her to a name, Dr. Richard Ashworth. His signature appeared on property deeds for both locations, where they'd found photographs. His research company owned dozens of abandoned buildings across the country. But when Emma tried to find information about Dr. Ashworth himself, she hit dead ends. Academic records that stopped abruptly in the early 2000s. Research papers that had been classified or withdrawn. A man who seemed to exist only in shadows and shell companies. Emma found reports of other missing persons connected to properties Dr. Ashworth owned. Urban explorers, photographers, security guards, all people who spent time in isolated locations, all people who might not be missed immediately if they disappeared. She began to understand the scope of what she was dealing with. This wasn't just stalking or surveillance. This was collection. Dr. Ashworth was collecting people, studying them, documenting them, and then replacing them. Emma realized she was probably the only person who knew the truth, which made her incredibly dangerous to Dr. Ashworth's operation, and incredibly vulnerable. She received a text from Jake one evening that contained coordinates and a simple instruction. Come alone. I know what's going on. Emma stared at the message, her hands shaking. The language was wrong. Jake never used periods in his messages. He always included emojis or casual abbreviations. This wasn't Jake, but it was an opportunity to find answers, to confront whatever had taken her friends. Emma knew it was a trap, but she also knew she couldn't live with the uncertainty anymore. She needed to know what had happened to the real Jake, Hannah, and Phil, even if it meant walking into Dr. Ashworth's hands. The coordinates led to a decommissioned military facility in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place where screams wouldn't carry and disappearances wouldn't be investigated. Emma found Jake waiting for her in the main building, but something was wrong with his eyes. They were too bright, too focused, like someone performing the role of Jake rather than being him. He led her through corridors lined with surveillance equipment and research materials. Rooms filled with photographs, thousands of them, showing hundreds of different people in their most private moments. And in the center of it all, a laboratory. Emma saw her friends there, the real Jake, Hannah, and Phil. But they weren't unconscious on examination tables. They were awake, fully conscious, their eyes wide with terror and recognition. Standing over them was a tall man in a dark coat, the figure from the photographs, Dr. Richard Ashworth. What Emma claims she saw in that laboratory defies human comprehension. Her friends were conscious, but completely paralyzed, unable to move or speak, but aware of everything happening to them. They'd been that way for weeks. Dr. Ashworth explained his work with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. He wasn't just creating replicas of his subjects. He was feeding off them. The paralyzed bodies were connected to machines that harvested their neural activity, their thoughts, memories, emotions, dreams. Everything that made them human was being slowly drained away to power the artificial constructs that had replaced them. But the process had to be gradual. Too fast, and the consciousness would shut down. The victims had to remain aware, experiencing every moment of their slow consumption. Emma watched in horror as the machines pulsed with each heartbeat, each breath, each terrified thought of her friends. Their eyes tracked her movement, pleading silently for help she couldn't provide. Dr. Ashworth told her that the process would take months to complete. Her friends would remain conscious throughout, feeling their personalities being slowly devoured, their memories harvested, their very souls consumed to animate their replacements. And when it was finished, when every last spark of their humanity had been extracted, their bodies would finally be allowed to die. but their suffering would continue in the artificial minds that had been built from their stolen essence. Emma tried to run, but the facility seemed to shift around her. Corridors led to dead ends. Exits became walls. The building itself seemed alive, hunting her. She could hear her friends screaming, not with their voices, which were paralyzed, but with their minds, their terror and agony echoing through the facility like a psychic storm. Emma found herself back in the laboratory, facing Dr. Ashworth and the thing that looked like Jake. Dr. Ashworth explained that Emma would join her friends soon. But first, he wanted to study her psychological breakdown. Her descent into madness would provide valuable data about the human mind's response to impossible horror. Emma's account of what happened next becomes increasingly incoherent. She speaks of machines that fed on screams, of her friend's consciousness being slowly digested, of artificial beings that wore familiar faces while their originals suffered in eternal torment. But according to hospital records, Emma was found 3 days later, alone in her flat, in a state of complete psychological breakdown. There was no military facility at those coordinates, no laboratory, no Dr. Ashworth, just an empty field. Emma was diagnosed with acute paranoid psychosis. Her claims about surveillance, replacement, and Dr. Ashworth were classified as elaborate delusions. The photographs she'd found were never located. Her research materials had been destroyed during what appeared to be a psychotic episode in her flat. Her friends visited, concerned and confused by her condition. Jake, Hannah, and Phil seemed genuinely worried about Emma's mental health. They had no memory of finding any photographs. They insisted that Emma had been acting strangely for weeks before her breakdown, becoming increasingly paranoid and isolated. But Emma noticed things about them that the doctors missed. The way Jake's smile never quite reached his eyes. How Hannah's laugh sounded slightly mechanical. The way Phil seemed to be accessing memories rather than remembering naturally. Most disturbing of all, sometimes Emma could swear. She heard screaming when they spoke. Faint cries of agony that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside their artificial minds. The voices of her real friends, still conscious, still suffering, trapped inside the constructs that had replaced them. Emma spent 18 months in psychiatric care. The medications helped with her anxiety, but they couldn't erase her memories of what she'd experienced. She learned to stop talking about Dr. Ashworth and the photographs. She learned to pretend that she accepted the official explanation for her breakdown, but she never stopped believing. Her friends visited less frequently as time went on. They'd moved on with their lives, started new projects, made new friends. Emma noticed that they never seemed to age, never changed, never developed new mannerisms or speech patterns. They were perfect frozen copies of who Jake, Hannah, and Phil had been at the moment of their replacement. And sometimes, when they thought she wasn't looking, Emma caught them staring at her with expressions of pure hunger, as if they were evaluating her, measuring her, deciding whether she was worth adding to Dr. Ashworth's collection. Emma realized that her time was running out. 2 years after her release, Emma was browsing YouTube when she found something that made her blood freeze. A new video on the Lost Spaces channel. Jake, Hannah, and Phil were back to urban exploration, documenting a series of abandoned hospitals. They looked exactly the same as they had before Emma's breakdown. Exactly the same. Not older. Not changed by the passage of time. Identical to how they'd appeared 3 years earlier. But as Emma watched the video, she noticed something that made her stomach turn. In the background audio, barely audible beneath their commentary, were other voices. Faint, desperate whispers that seemed to be coming from the explorers themselves. The voices were pleading, begging, screaming in agony. Emma realized she was hearing the consciousness of her real friends, still trapped inside the artificial constructs, still being slowly consumed, still experiencing every moment of their torment. They were trying to communicate, trying to warn others, trying to scream for help through the mouths of their own replacements. But no one else could hear them. No one else was listening. Emma began investigating again, but more carefully this time. She couldn't afford another breakdown, another hospitalization. She found new reports of impossible photographs. More urban explorers claiming to have been surveilled in ways that defied explanation. Most of these reports were quickly discredited. The witnesses were diagnosed with mental health issues, their stories dismissed as delusions. But Emma saw the pattern. Dr. Ashworth was still collecting, still replacing, still feeding off the consciousness of his victims while their artificial doubles lived their lives. And Emma was still the only person who remembered the truth. She began documenting everything, creating hidden backups of her research, preparing for the day when she might have another chance to expose Dr. Ashworth's operation. But she also knew that time was running out, because Emma had started noticing signs that she was being watched again. And sometimes, late at night, she could swear she heard screaming coming from inside her own walls. The photograph showed Emma at her computer, researching Dr. Ashworth's activities. It had been taken from inside her room, from an angle that should have been impossible. But it was what Emma heard when she picked up the photograph that truly terrified her. Faint whispers seemed to emanate from the image itself. The voices of Jake, Hannah, and Phil, still conscious, still suffering, somehow embedded in the very fabric of the photograph. They were trying to warn her, trying to tell her to run. But it was too late. On the back of the photograph, in neat handwriting, was a message. Some collections are never complete. Your friends are waiting for you to join them. They have so much they want to share with you. Emma realized that Dr. Ashworth had been waiting, watching her recovery, monitoring her investigation, allowing her to believe she was safe. But now she'd gone too far, learned too much, become too dangerous to leave alone. Emma understood that she was about to become the next addition to Dr. Ashworth's collection. The only question was how long her consciousness would last before it was completely consumed, and whether anyone would hear her screaming from inside her own replacement. Emma disappeared on a Tuesday night in October. Her neighbors reported hearing sounds of a struggle, but when police investigated, they found no signs of forced entry or violence. Emma's caseworker assumed she'd simply moved without updating her address. People in supervised living situations often relocated without notice. Her disappearance wasn't investigated. But 3 weeks later, Emma reappeared. She seemed fine, healthy, apologetic about her unexplained absence, which she attributed to a spontaneous trip to visit family. Her caseworker noted that Emma seemed more stable than she'd been in years. Her obsessions with surveillance and conspiracy theories appeared to have resolved completely. Emma had finally accepted that her experiences had been delusions. She was ready to move forward with her life. But there was something different about her eyes, something that suggested the person living in Emma's apartment might not be Emma at all. And sometimes, when she spoke, other voices seemed to whisper beneath her words. The video appeared on a new YouTube channel called Truth Seekers Anonymous. In it, a woman who looked exactly like Emma addressed the camera directly. She explained that she'd been suffering from severe mental illness for several years, that she'd created elaborate conspiracy theories to explain her anxiety and paranoia. She wanted to apologize to anyone who'd been influenced by her delusions. to make it clear that stories about surveillance, impossible photographs, and mysterious collectors were products of psychological breakdown, not reality. She urged viewers to seek professional help if they found themselves believing in similar conspiracy theories. The video was articulate, convincing, and completely rational. It was also terrifying. Because, if you listened carefully, you could almost hear other voices beneath Emma's words. Faint whispers of agony and desperation that seemed to be coming from inside her throat. The voices of people who were still conscious, still suffering, still trying to scream warnings through the mouths of their own replacements. But the artificial Emma continued speaking, her smile never wavering, even as the screams of her original grew louder in the background. Somewhere, in a facility that doesn't officially exist, or perhaps in the fractured mind of a woman who could never accept that her friends had simply grown apart, the truth remains hidden. Emma's story raises questions that have no clear answers. Was Dr. Ashworth real, or was he a delusion created by a mind that couldn't cope with isolation and paranoia? Were her friends actually replaced, or did Emma's mental illness cause her to see sinister motives in their natural changes and busy lives? The evidence contradicts itself at every turn. Hospital records show Emma alone in her flat during her breakdown, but neighbours reported hearing multiple voices. The photographs were never found, but Emma's research materials showed signs of having been deliberately destroyed by someone else. Her friends insist they never found any pictures, but their social media activity did show subtle changes that began around the time Emma claims they were replaced. Then there's the woman who returned 3 weeks later. Emma's caseworker noted that she seemed remarkably stable, almost overnight. Her speech patterns had subtly changed. Her mannerisms were slightly different. Even her handwriting looked practiced, as if someone had been studying how to replicate it. Was this the real Emma, finally recovered from her delusions? Or was it something else entirely, wearing her face and living her life, while the original remained trapped somewhere beyond reach? The video on Truth Seekers Anonymous offers no clarity. The woman speaking looks like Emma, sounds like Emma, knows everything Emma would know. Her explanation of mental illness and conspiracy theories is rational and convincing. But there's something in her eyes that seems wrong. Something that suggests she's reading from a script rather than speaking from experience. And if you listen to the audio with headphones, if you isolate the frequencies and amplify the background noise, you might hear something that sounds like whispers. Desperate voices that seem to be coming from inside the speaker herself. But audio equipment can play tricks. Digital compression can create artifacts that sound like voices when none exist. The Lost Spaces channel continues to upload new content. Jake, Hannah, and Phil explore abandoned locations with the same enthusiasm they always had. They look healthy, happy, unchanged by the passage of time, in ways that could be explained by good genetics and careful editing. Their commentary flows naturally. Their friendship seems genuine. Their reactions to their environments appear authentic. But some viewers have noticed inconsistencies, references to shared memories that don't quite match earlier videos, slight changes in their knowledge of urban exploration techniques, moments where they seem to pause, as if accessing information rather than remembering it naturally. And in the background audio of their latest uploads, there are sounds that don't quite belong. Whispers that could be wind through broken windows. Cries that could be distant birds. Screaming that could be rusty metal grinding against itself. Or they could be something else entirely. The truth is, we may never know what really happened to Emma and her friends. Mental illness can create elaborate delusions that feel completely real to those experiencing them. Paranoid psychosis can make ordinary coincidences seem like evidence of vast conspiracies. The human mind, when fractured, can construct entire realities that exist nowhere but in the sufferer's perception. But mental illness can also make people sensitive to things others miss. Paranoia can sometimes detect real threats that everyone else ignores. And sometimes, the people we dismiss as delusional are the only ones brave enough to speak truths that the rest of us refuse to acknowledge. So when you watch those urban exploration videos, when you see people documenting abandoned places and forgotten spaces, pay attention. Look for the signs Emma described. Listen for the whispers she claimed to hear. Notice if someone you know seems subtly different, as if they're performing their own personality rather than living it. Because whether Emma's story was real or imagined, whether Dr. Ashworth exists or was a product of her fractured mind, the questions she raised remain valid. In a world where we're constantly watched, constantly documented, constantly surveilled, how would we know if someone was collecting us? How would we recognize if the people we love had been replaced by something that only looked like them? And if you start to suspect that something is wrong, if you begin to notice the signs Emma described, if you find photographs of yourself that shouldn't exist, remember that there are two possibilities. Either you're experiencing the same delusions that destroyed Emma's life, or you're discovering the same truth that led to her disappearance. The question is, which possibility terrifies you more? Thanks for watching this investigation into one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries in the urban exploration community. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the unexplained, please give this video a like and subscribe for more content exploring the dark corners of our world. And remember to hit that notification bell, because in a world where the truth is increasingly hard to distinguish from delusion, staying informed might be the only thing keeping you safe. Until next time, keep exploring, but always watch your back.